Welcome, everybody, to our event today. My name is Eddie Casado, and I'm the Affiliate and Technology Partnerships Manager at Convert. We are a battle-tested A/B testing tool that has been around for around 15 years or so. So I'd like to say we know a little bit about CRO, but when we don't, we try to pull in some people that can actually enrich the conversation like today. So Inavi, one of our partners, is with us today, and we're going to be covering that little instance when you think that your A/B tests are winning, but they're not actually moving the needle. This is volume 2 of that conversation, and today we have Anthony Morgan with us from Inavi. Anthony, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Eddie. I'm excited for it today. It's going to be action-packed. Lots of content to go through.
Well, last one was filled with great insights based on actual events and not necessarily anything synthetic. So definitely looking forward to our conversation today. I just want to give a brief shout out to Sheldon from Inavide, who couldn't join us because he felt sick. So Sheldon, I'm sure that you're tuning in. We're gonna miss you, buddy, but I'm gonna do my best to channel my inner Sheldon for the conversation with Anthony. So, with that much, I want to mention that today's meeting is being recorded, and we have Vlad from Team Convert under controls managing the conversation. So if you have questions, make sure you can use the LinkedIn comments section or the Zoom chat. I'll be fielding those along with Vlad. But with that, I'll give it to you, Anthony, so that you can kickstart the conversation.
Yeah, thank you everybody for showing up. Like I said, there's quite a bit to go through today. We're going to go really in depth on what it looks like to take your program and turn it into something that's ultimately producing long-term sustainable growth. There's lots of brands that are A/B testing. Many are doing it in-house. Many are working with agencies. And so the real question is the impact actually there? Am I feeling the impact? Are my A/B test wins real? We get those questions all the time. We see the CRO scar tissue, as we like to call it, all the time. And so we're going to go through some of that today. I'll start us off with kind of a brief introduction on who we are at Inavi, if you're not familiar with us. Like Eddie said earlier today, it's just me. Unfortunately, Sheldon's not here, so you're going to have to listen to me ramble for the next 45 minutes. And I don't have a radio voice like Sheldon does, so I apologize. But if you don't know, eNavi, we are a CRO agency. Our approach to CRO is what we call human obsessed. And so we really try to get into the mind of the customer, understand why they buy, why they don't buy, and then leverage that to not only improve your on-site experience, but take those learnings into all of your different marketing efforts. And in many cases, they can disrupt your business and the trajectory of how you're thinking about growth and opportunities in that regard. And so we work predominantly with Shopify stores, 8 and 9 figure brands. My background was in-house, started doing CRO there. Many of this conversation is rooted in our failures over time and learning and growing. My failures in-house doing CRO, and then as we grow and learn as an agency through failure, this is going to be a lot of what we talk about is things that we kind of learned from failure and from experience. And so I'm excited to dive through it because there's a lot that can be used by each of you that are, whether you're working with an agency, whether you're doing it in-house, to help level up your CRO programs, get the most out of your A/B testing, and ensure that you're actually moving forward with confidence and learning, producing long-term sustainable growth. So quick little rundown on the outline of what we're talking through today. So we're going to talk through self-service Sugar Rush, and then we're going to go through a couple different kind of frameworks that you can leverage. We have the 3I iteration loop, the 3P protocol, fancy names for things that we hope makes CRO more approachable. That's one of our goals at eNavi. And then the last thing is kind of some diagnostic principles to kind of give a check on how you're performing, how you're doing tests. Are we operating in a way that is actually going to produce long-term sustainable growth, going to produce impactful learnings and A/B test results that we can actually trust? Like Eddie said, this is being recorded, so you'll have access to this afterwards. I'm happy to share the slide deck to you. If you'd like to have that too, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll try to leave like 15 minutes for that. Hopefully I'm not long-winded, so we have that time because I want to make sure that we do. And then if you have any questions that come up throughout, feel free to drop those in the comments. We'll make sure that those get answered at the end of me talking and our Q&A. So that's some housekeeping there, and let's get into the actual presentation. So would you push this test live on your store? We're looking at this test. We've got a test that is on day 2. The platform is saying it's a winner with 95% confidence, an 18% lift. Do you ship it? Do you implement this? Do you see this as a winner? That's a very real question. If this is how you operate, go ahead, raise your hand, say yes if you want to. We're going to talk through how this is probably dangerous and detrimental to your approach. And there's ways that you can actually operate in a much better, more confident way. This will give you an illusion of confidence, but in reality, if you let this test run longer, it might actually be flat. It could actually be a loss. Many larger 8 and 9-figure stores can see these types of results on day 2, especially if you're running something that's more global. You've got a significant amount of traffic. This can very easily happen. And we've seen over and over again where just because a test starts really negative or really positive doesn't mean that's how it's going to end when we let it run for the full length that we planned. So we're going to unpack that because there's a lot to kind of learn and apply from that. So first things first, part 1, the self-service sugar rush. Say that 10 times fast. The kind of definition of self-service CRO, I want to make sure we define this because the last thing I want to do and the last thing that we want to do at eNavi is kind of have our noses stuck up and be like, if you're doing in-house CRO, you're doing it wrong. There's a lot of brands that are doing it well, but oftentimes what we see in conversations, this is some of the things that we commonly see in internal CRO efforts. And in a second, we'll talk about kind of why this ends up happening, why brands end up operating this way. And so really some of the things that we see that are common characteristics of self-service CRO is typically enabled by no-code test builders. That's not a bad thing. There's a lot of value in being able to what we call test before you invest. So you're not having to, pay for development on a test. You can easily iterate, create a test that can allow you to move at a higher velocity. There's a lot of positives in that. We're big fans of MVP testing. And then the second thing is test ideas are coming from best practices, competitors, platform suggestions. So your A/B testing might have a library of A/B test ideas. Prioritization oftentimes defaults to what can be built the quickest or what the boss says, or what we like to commonly say in the CRO space, the hippo is kind of pushing around. And so these are some of the common things that we see within the self-service CRO space. I wanted to make sure that we're kind of on the same page with the language there and what we're using. And so the reason why we see brands kind of operating this way is typically because the tools make it really easy to launch fast, which is a good thing. The platforms, oftentimes, their dashboards create false confidence. There's these tests that look like they're statistically confident and significant, but in reality, they're actually really underpowered, loaded with false positives. And then there's this pressure. There's an internal pressure to prove out the value of CRO, to prove out the value of A/B testing to win. Because if you're not winning, oftentimes the perspective is that you're not making an impact. And so that can create this kind of forced striving for wins. And then it's really the loudest voice in the Shopify space is this whole idea of winning A/B tests. Like that is the holy grail, is we need to win, we need to win, we need to win. That's how we produce ROI. And so
Anthony, I just wanted to mention that it's as you're mentioning that false sense or the sense of urgency of having the winning tests and whether or not I think that topic kind of segues a little bit into what we're trying to highlight today, right? Which is whether or not whatever the tool is telling you is really moving the needle, and diving deeper to understand whether it's moving the needle or not. And I think that part of the CRO program success is not only having winning tests, but having winning structures and processes, right? Because you might have a losing test, but if you're taking away great amount of insights to propel the business forward, then is it really a losing experiment, or is it really winning in the long term? So I think it's a very interesting contrast there, and what we're trying to talk about today versus how CRO is perceived in the organization.
Exactly. No, that's so true. And that's the thing. Good CRO starts with a good process, having a framework and a process in place that you're following. There's a method to the madness, and you're not just kind of like randomly doing things. That process is what's going to produce the results. That's what's going to produce the long-term sustainable growth. And so one of I think the biggest things that we see that is oftentimes the reason why in-house CRO or self-service CRO leans into these kind of characteristics is usually because of time, right? The biggest constraint is time. I was in-house, I get it. You're stretched thin. There's a bunch of different priorities. Oftentimes they're conflicting. It's really hard to focus. It's really hard to be able to put time and take time on the process. And so it's pretty common that it's just like, well, the biggest value here is getting wins. And so you're going to skip certain aspects in the process as a result. And so this is not only happening with in-house teams, we see this across the board with even agencies. I mean, a lot of agencies that are offering CRO. We'll touch a little bit more kind of on that later as we talk through results and how to really understand them, and try to do that in an approachable way. So now that we know what we talk about when we say self-service, I want to talk about the sugar rush. What is a sugar rush? These are ultimately kind of the quick wins that you get from maybe best practices, apps, swipe files, competitors, platform suggestions. In some cases, these will produce a short-term boost of performance, but like with any sugar rush, there is often a sugar crash. And so it doesn't mean that that's actually going to be a sustainable result. And if there's nothing you can actually really learn from it, how impactful was it? And so that's an important thing that we'll talk about a little bit later. And so that's kind of the biggest problem with a sugar rush is the quick wins feel rewarding. There's this dopamine hit from the green arrows. I get it. I love a winning test. You get these huge promise gains. It feels good to have a win. Like, well, I'm not saying winning doesn't matter. Winning does matter, but it's not the most important thing. And so that is the problem with the sugar rush is you get this high, but really there is not this long-term impact as a result.
Anthony,
So
would you
yeah,
would you actually argue that this sugar rush has a place in the strategy? Like if you're starting up a CRO program in an organization that is not too well versed in experimentation, do you think that there is a place for that sugar rush to happen so that you can build confidence with stakeholders, with the hippos and everybody, so that you can actually then, in parallel, as you're running this short wins, quick wins, sugar rush like experiments, to build that confidence and in parallel work on the actual processes to make this happen so that when you start losing, you actually have some cred, some street cred, so you say,
yeah,
within the organization?
yeah, 100%. That's key. Getting that initial buy-in, identifying who and how you need to ultimately get that buy-in is super important. And in the process of doing kind of educating on the process too. We touched on that a lot during like our last webinar when we're talking about ROI. We're talking about getting stakeholder decision maker buy-in when you're doing CRO. And so oftentimes some of these tests that you may bucket as a just do it but you end up testing early on in the program to ultimately get that buy-in, to show some results initially, especially if you have like a stakeholder or decision maker that's really like win hungry, just kind of waiting for those wins. It can be valuable to leverage that sugar rush to your advantage. So the three common misconceptions in self-service CRO programs. The first one is only substantial or disruptive tests will move the needle. When we think about the types of tests, there's really three types. You have iterative, you have substantial, you have disruptive. Iterative are like your smaller changes. Let's say, for instance, you're changing a piece of copy or you're testing a button color. When we're talking about substantial, you're moving a little bit more. It's a much larger change. It could be a change in the UX flow. When we move into like disruptive, we're talking about something that could shift the way that the business is operating. This could be an offer. You're changing the offer and you're testing the control offer versus a variant offer. And so there's oftentimes this common belief that the size of your swing is the most important thing, and that you're wasting your time by doing iterative tests, when in reality, it's more about the size of the problem than the size of the swing. You can have an iterative test that hits on a really big problem and produces a really impactful win. And so that is really important to understand. We'll talk a little bit more about iterative, substantial, and disruptive tests and what it looks like to actually leverage those within a program and what we kind of recommend for how to do them. Because in reality, you can't consistently do disruptive tests. Otherwise, you're going to be probably testing at a much lower velocity than we would recommend. But this is the first one that's really important. It's more about the size of the problem than the size of the swing. The second thing is we should be running 10 plus tests per month. I talked to a brand last year, very popular brand. Many of you probably know them. They're running 30 A/B tests a month. And they had like one person and a developer that were running all these tests. I know they were an 8-figure brand, probably between 50 and 100 million. There's no way that their site traffic could reasonably withstand 30 tests a month. And so I have no idea what the quality of the tests are or the quality of the ideas, but more tests don't guarantee more winning. And they definitely don't guarantee more learning. It's more about the quality of your tests than anything. Velocity is important. You want to have a minimum velocity. And if you can improve velocity, that can be impactful because it can increase the learning and the speed at which you're learning. But it's really important that you get the things that we'll talk about today right before you start focusing on running 10 plus tests a month. The third thing here is that multivariate testing will increase our likelihood of winning. When we're talking about multivariate testing, we're talking about the control versus A, B, C, D. There's some people in the Shopify CRO space that talk about this as like the holy grail and the only way to move the needle. When in reality, most brands actually can't support this. And most brands aren't approaching these, if they are running multivariate tests, approaching this in a way that's actually impactful through the lens of like learning when you're testing. And so we end up seeing a lot of inconclusive data, false positives that end up getting associated as this is a winner or this is the way we should go. And so we like to kind of stay away from those, especially as you're initially starting. If you have the traffic to support it and you've proven the process and you're following the process, you can move into this, but I would consider this more of a mature step in the process of running a CRO program. So the three dangers that plague self-service CRO programs: ideas are not rooted in real problems. So what we commonly see with this is brands will test what's easy to build or what competitors are doing, especially if it's something that's easy to spin up and test. Okay, for instance, we see one of our competitors has a sticky add to cart on the product page. We need to add a sticky add to cart and test that. That can be a good idea. it can work well, especially when it's rooted in a problem. Like, hey, we've got a lot of content. We see that users are actually scrolling and we have pretty good scroll depth. Maybe adding a sticky add to cart can be impactful in that situation. But that doesn't mean that that's going to produce long-term sustainable growth. Just because it shows that initial win doesn't mean that's going to hold up for 6, 12, 18, 24 months. And so the big thing here, like we talked about before, it's not about the size of the swing, but it's about the size of the problem, right? The size of the problem is more important than the size of the swing. And so we'll see kind of window dressing experiments that really don't teach you anything. You don't learn anything from them. And that's oftentimes what we see in these best practices or in these kind of platform suggested A/B tests. And so it's really important that your problems or your ideas are rooted in clear data-driven problems.
Anthony, before we move on, I just wanted to come back to something you mentioned that, for example, that experiment of the sticky add to cart, it might not hold up 6, 8, 12 months beyond. Does this mean that you need to continue testing the same idea every once in a while, like that experiment that you launched and won? Should it come back as another experiment later on to validate or to continue to validate whether there were some UX traffic changes that might have influenced some of the results you got? And this might be just a very rookie question, but I'm just wondering, how do you approach that? Because if the change doesn't hold up, did you mean before it was validated or after it was validated through an A/B test?
Yeah, so what I'm saying, the change didn't hold up. Oftentimes what we'll see is you'll see a test that, that'll have a monthly revenue lift kind of tied to it. And then sometimes people will take that revenue lift and times it by 12 to say, here's the annualized value of
Okay.
that test. The reality is that's just not how it works. I could run this test today on December 9th, run it for 2 weeks, all the way till about Christmas, then go run it in July, and I'm probably going to get different results. No
Right.
matter what the
And
test is, you're going to get
yeah.
different results. And so there are situations where as your site changes, as your customer changes, as the market shifts, there is value in rerunning tests
Right.
and validating that, hey, this is still working today and has earned its place on the page.
Right. And I think this goes back to our first volume 1 of our conversation where you introduced that the grading of the impact of the winning experiment, right? I think there was like a 20% degrade throughout 6 months, I think it was. Maybe you can remind the audience of that so that they can go watch the other volume and come back with some other insights out of this one.
Yeah, that's where we talked about kind of the expectations when it comes to the ROI of your CRO program. Many times the expectation is that it's all produced through winning A/B tests, but in reality, there is multiple components that kind of make that up. And when we're looking at A/B tests that win, and what we like to do instead of just looking at the monthly revenue and then times that by 12, is we have that set up so that month 1 is the actual revenue lift that was tied to the test. And then every single month until month 6, it decreases down to 0. So you have this decay. And that's kind of how one of the ways that we quantify ROI and how test wins kind of stack up. It's not a perfect science, but if you're really struggling with, talking through your ROI, communicating that to stakeholders, I would highly recommend watching our previous webinar where we go a lot further in depth on that idea. Number 2 here of the kind of dangers of self-service CRO programs is there's no pre-test discipline. Oftentimes there's not a clear prioritization framework, again, defaulting to the easiest build or whatever is loudest, or sometimes what is most disruptive in the eyes of the stakeholder. We'll see that tests aren't properly powered. There's not a sample size and duration set beforehand that you hold to. And then platforms ultimately encourage tests to end early because you got 95% confidence at day 2. And so false positives compound, superficial wins reach the live site. But most of these changes are empty calories versus more solid building blocks. Number 3 here is lots of results, but no next steps. And so this is where we're going to go into talking through A/B testing primarily as a means of research than a mean to validate. There's value in the validation and the confidence that you can have from the results of your A/B tests, especially if you're following a clear process. But there's so much you can learn from your losing tests, from your winning tests, from even your flat tests. And so that is really important, is thinking through this. And so we're going to give you a framework to kind of think through this, how you can ultimately take away, not just should we implement this, but what can we do next with this? What have we learned from this? How does it affect what we know about our customer and our testing roadmap? So here's a real world example of a brand that we actively are working with, where they were running kind of self-service CRO before they turned to us. And when we looked at and kind of did a diagnostic of their previous A/B testing efforts, we realized that the majority of them were kind of riddled with false positives. There was a lot of tests that were not backed by kind of a clear process, good data, trustworthy data. And so there was a lot of things that were getting implemented and seen as winners that actually weren't winners. And so you have this site that's changing and evolving with a bunch of things that actually aren't making a difference to the customer. And in some cases, some of those things were actually probably not producing a positive and producing a negative, but they were kind of sneaking through because of the lack of kind of quality data and trustworthy data. And so as a result, their conversion rate started trending down. This wasn't the core reason. There was other things affecting this too, but their conversion rate started to trend down as they were testing more, implementing more, and implementing these so-called winners. And so this is a real-world example of kind of the dangers of what can happen when you don't have a clear process and you're just kind of running A/B tests randomly, hoping for the best, ending results once you reach stat sig, and then implementing and kind of enjoying that sugar rush that you get. Like I said, oftentimes after the sugar rush comes a sugar crash. So how to avoid those misconceptions and dangers? There's really 2 frameworks that we're going to go over today. We have the 3I iteration loop. The intent of this is to help with better thinking, fueling better test ideas through a repeated research and validation process. And then the next one is better execution of your tests. So the 3P protocol, this is transforming test into a research method with data that you can trust. So the first one we're going to get into is the 3I iteration loop. This is part of our 5I method, which is kind of our end-to-end approach of CRO, that the process. This is the last 3 steps, and this is ultimately the loop as you get started in a CRO program. Once you hit step 3, it becomes a loop. And so you can see the loop here. It starts with insights, the data points that shape your approach to testing. Then it goes to implementation, the testable concept you create to validate your idea. And then 3, interpretation, the customer knowledge you gain as a result of the test. Notice we're thinking about it through the lens of customer knowledge, not through merely just validating that we made an impact. And ultimately then implementing whether it's a winner or not implementing because it's a loser. So phase 1, insights. This is where your test ideas are ultimately rooted in research, not best practices or platform suggestions. And this is where ultimately the best ideas come from multiple data points pointing in the same direction, where you've got qualitative research, quantitative research, ultimately pointing you into these ideas and these opportunities to test. And so it's really this process that is key to producing great ideas. And we're going to look at this process with a real life case study on how we had an initial idea that lost, and then it was transformed through this process into a winning test in a following iteration. The second phase is implementation. this is where you're actually testing it. So you're creating that hypothesis. What should this result tell us about our customers? Not just validating that it has a conversion rate impact, but what are we actually going to learn about our customer in the process of doing this? We're then prioritizing which ones are actually going to make the biggest impact. We'll talk through a prioritization framework that you can use, and then we'll do pre-test analysis, the setup and launch, making sure that we understand the key metrics that we need to track, the length at which we need to conduct this test to ultimately get results that we can learn from and that we can be confident in. Phase 3 is interpretation. So this is after the test has been completed, we need to do our post-test review. And we want to do this through the lens of learning. What do we learn about our customer from this result? Based on the result, what are the next steps we can further capitalize on in our findings? We want to communicate this across the team. We don't want these to stay siloed. These learnings are really important and impactful. So we want to make sure that everybody in the organization is hearing about these. So what can we communicate? How can we communicate these learnings well? This ultimately becomes a loop, right? And so it restarts right after this back to insights, and that's feeding our next set of ideas. It's feeding potentially an iteration on this test right here. And this is how kind of the 3I iteration loop makes wins compound over time, and you actually start making an impact. And as a result of phase 3, you're thinking through A/B testing as a means to actually learn, not just a means to validate with confidence that you made an impact. So that's why it's a loop, not a line. Oftentimes what we see is this kind of traditional approach within the self-service space is research, test, and then potentially implement if it's a winner into production, and then move on to something else. If it loses, we're going to scrap it, move on, it didn't work. When we're looking at the 3I loop, we're talking about research, test, learn, research, better test, deeper learning. Like it's just a loop. You're continuously learning, producing better ideas as a result. Multiple data points start to really point to new ideas, new opportunities, and you start to produce just better and better test ideas as a result of this loop.
Anthony, we have a question from Baron, which I think it fits really nicely into the flow. He has a question about when should one consider retesting a previous win versus testing another prioritized test in a roadmap, which goes back to this loop, the 3I loop that you're mentioning. How do you negotiate between, okay, I'm going to keep iterating over this hypothesis or this experiment versus, okay, I'm going to leave this one for now and I'm going to move on to this one. What is the threshold there? How do you guys negotiate what goes next?
Yeah, good to hear from you, Baron. Of course, you'd ask a question that really depends. It depends on what you're testing, how relevant that is to the problems that you're trying to solve, that you're prioritizing. Like within our framework, we have a strategic priority every 90 days that we're pressing into. So we try to have a pretty narrow focus on how we're attacking kind of CRO for a client. And so depending on where that test that you need to rerun kind of falls, if it's something that's aligned with the priority and we're looking at a prioritization framework, it rises to the top, then run it again. Especially if you feel like you feel really confident in the test and there's significant learnings that you could get from it as a result, then I would recommend kind of surfacing that to the top. Because oftentimes what will happen is if you don't do that within like a 3-month period, that test idea will just kind of disappear and you'll move on to something else. Yeah. And so doing it kind of immediately, if it rises to the top within your prioritization framework, would be what I would recommend.
So you get the new experiment, the new hypothesis out of the winning test to create an iteration, and that iteration or that hypothesis should go against the rest of the tasks or the rest of initiatives that you have already iced or whatever in the prioritization framework that you're using.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. You got a fire from Baron, so good job.
Cool. Thanks, Baron. So we're going to go into the 3P protocol. Step 1 here, And when we're looking at this, let me actually take a step back here. When we're looking at this, we're talking about running better tests. That's what this protocol is for. That's what these 3Ps are. It's all about running better tests. When we're looking at the iteration loop, where we have the 3 I's, the first I is insights, the second I is implement, and the third I is interpret. And so this is going to be between implementing, it's going to start at implementing, and it's going to go through your interpretation. So it's going to cover those 2 steps, and there's just like a 3-step process here. And so step 1 is prioritization. It's really important to have a framework for prioritizing your efforts. And so this is a simple example of a PXL prioritization framework. This is probably the most common framework that you see in the CRO space. We use an adapted version of this at eNavi, but this is a great one to work with. Some important components of it to go over is really these first 4. You have above the fold, right? How relevant is it? How often is it going to get viewed, right? That's an important thing to measure by, because you want your tests to actually be noticed and not just buried on the page. Is it noticeable within 5 seconds? Are you adding or removing an element? Is it designed to increase user motivation? Is it running on a high traffic page? Is it addressing an issue discovered via user testing? Is it addressing an issue discovered via qualitative feedback? Is it addressing an issue found in your quantitative analysis, in your digital analytics? Is it supported by mouse tracking, heat map, or eye tracking? So ultimately, is it rooted in research? If it's rooted in research, it's going to get more prioritized. And so the ideas that are more noticeable, more rooted in research are going to rise to the top. And then you have ease of implementation. And that's going to also factor in there. You want to make sure that you're not just running a bunch of tests that are really difficult to set up, and then you're only running 1 test a month. And so this is really important. You can see some of the components there, but having this is very important so that you are actually prioritizing the right opportunities, the research-backed opportunities. And so please have a prioritization framework in place. The second thing here is pre-test analysis. And so most tests actually are wrong from the start before they're even launched, because the wrong sample size, the wrong duration, the wrong success metrics are defined. I'm not even going to go into secondary or guardrail metrics here. We're only going to touch on just kind of really some basics here. And so this affects the confidence that you can have in the results and your ability to learn. So it's really important that you actually get this set up correctly. And so we're talking about setting up your sample size calculation, doing it a minimum of 2 weeks, making sure that you have the proper swim lane set up so that it's not potentially contaminated by another test. You have the right success metrics. You have a hypothesis. Actually write a hypothesis. The amount of times that I don't see hypothesis written is mind-boggling to me. Like, you need to learn something from this, so just write a hypothesis. It's a simple exercise. You can create a framework for it. But this is really important when it comes to pre-test analysis. There's a great tool by abtestguide.com that has a calculator that you can use to help you do your pre-test analysis and know how long you need to run a test based off of the number of conversions, based off of the sample size, so you can have confidence in your learning and in your results. Step 3 is post-test review. This is so crucial because it's commonly overlooked. What we most commonly see is we just default to, was it a win? Was it a loss? Was it flat? Okay, win, we're going to implement. Loss, we're going to scrap. And flat, we're just going to move on. But there's so much more that can ultimately be learned as a result. We want to see testing as a method of research, not just a means to validate ideas. When viewed this way, you're going to produce better ideas as a result. That's where you create this loop. A losing test honestly teaches you as much or maybe even more than a winning test. And so we have many examples of this where we had a winning test ultimately, or a losing test, produce really good learnings. And so, for instance, there is a brand that had a guarantee. It had a guarantee that was directly related to the variants that the user selected when they're choosing a color. And the guarantee was, they could send it back, no questions asked, pretty much free returns, right? Well, when we actually introduced that right below the add to cart button, it had a pretty detrimental impact to conversion rate. And we learned as a result of that even with that added, it introduced doubt to users that weren't even thinking about that wasn't getting addressed properly through the rest of the experience. And so that losing test had a really big learning for us. We then were able to dive really deep into that particular problem, and ultimately solve it in 1,000 different ways. But losing tests are so incredibly valuable, and so do have a post-test review. Don't just think about it, did we win or did we lose?
Anthony, out of curiosity, how did you come about the fact that introducing that bit of text introduced doubt into the purchasing process? Like, how did you validate that?
How did we validate that? Yeah, I mean, as a result of the test, we saw that all of the post add to cart metrics, begin checkout, conversion rate, were down statistically significant. We're talking like
Okay.
5 to 6%. So a
Wow.
fairly, for a brand of this size with the amount of traffic we're running into the test, we're 100% confident in those results. And then so from that, we're seeing that, hey, if we're introducing this and it's actually having a negative impact, we can then imply, based off of all the other research that we have that says this is a huge problem,
Mm-hmm.
the color selection, that this is actually introducing doubt to users that maybe weren't even thinking about it previously. They weren't
Right.
even thinking about, oh, is this the right one for me? Is this the right color for me? They were going to purchase. But as a
Right.
result, we introduced some doubt with this guarantee related to the color they were selecting.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing, man.
Yeah. So what this ends up looking like, so I hinted at this earlier. We're going to go through a case study. Actually, sorry, wrong part of the presentation. We're actually going to go through kind of the difference between most self-serve A/B test results, what that looks like, and then actually what you could learn from a single test. So on this left side, we added a scarcity messaging and conversion rate went up. Potential next steps, what did you learn, right? You can learn some stuff from that, but oftentimes we don't see that. We don't see those learnings then pulled out, then capitalized on. And that's a very like tactical surface level kind of CRO test. Whereas in the second example here, where we had a test where you used a short description copy to validate the number one anxiety customers have about the product. If that was a winning test, or even if that was a losing test, you could learn so much about that, right? Can we further reassure with maybe visuals in the image gallery? Could we better speak to that in our ad headlines in creative? Are there ways we can address the fear in the onboarding process or the unboxing process? There's so much that you can kind of learn and questions that could come out as a result, hypothesis that could come out as a result of this single test idea that is far less kind of tactical and surface level CRO as we see in that first example. So part 4 is the case study. This is a brand that we work with, and this was the first test that we ran with them. This is a common kind of concept that we like to do. The reason we like to do what we call copy and bullets is it takes the copy, if there is copy, or if there isn't copy, we can then communicate the copy in a way that's really digestible, especially for users that are on mobile. So for this brand, they had a bunch of copy above the add to cart button. As you can see here, there is a lot of copy. What we did is we wanted to clean that up. We didn't want that to be 1.5 folds, especially on mobile, right? And so we cleaned that up, converted it to copy and bullets, and conversion rate plummeted 11.73%. And this was like 97% confidence. It was clear that we touched on something that really mattered. And what we thought we were doing was making the copy more digestible. But as a result, we're actually pulling out important parts and important kind of language and verbiage that was being used in this more longer form copy. And so we didn't stop and say, okay, this copy and bullets doesn't work. It's not going to work for CastleFlex. We're just going to move on. No, what we did is we went through, did our post-test review. What did we learn? What was different from the copy that we used, from the copy that was in the control? What are we seeing in post-purchase surveys? What are we seeing in review mining? What are the different data points that we can ultimately kind of triangulate to create a better iteration of this test? And so that's where we then iterated on this, and we kept the framework. The copy was still fairly long, actually, in this second iteration. It wouldn't be our typical kind of copy and bullets, but we definitely trimmed it down so it wasn't nearly as much on mobile. We added, we kind of highlighted in bold some of the key copy that we saw in review mining and post-purchase surveys, and boom, we had a winner, a 4.21% increase in conversion rate. And so you can see through this iteration, the result of kind of taking a losing test, learning from it, taking other data, and bringing out a new idea as a result. That was the iteration, the 3I iteration loop in practice in this case study here. So the takeaway, it's not a line, it's a loop. Just because you had a losing test or you had a winning test doesn't mean you stop there. You can continue to iterate. There's plenty of juice oftentimes that you can get out of a winning test. There's more juice to squeeze out of that hypothesis, out of that idea, out of that problem, out of that opportunity that you're hitting on. So part 4 here is our diagnostic principles. So the really important thing when it comes to your CRO program and your approach is to have a clear priority. This here, the inter-site funnel, kind of preludes everything. This is what we would kind of consider before the 3I iteration loop in our 5I method, when we're trying to understand where we should focus efforts. So what are the funnel steps that are performing the worst? Where's the biggest bottleneck at? And so we're taking conversion rate, breaking it up into the 4 key metrics that lead to a conversion, segmenting that down. We've got a great looker report for this, and this will allow you to focus and prioritize on the most important kind of bottleneck in your store. And what it does is it also brings common language that your organization can use. And so I always recommend starting with the inter-site funnel. That'll give you clarity, that'll give you focus, that'll help you prioritize efforts. You can then plug this into your prioritization framework and actually prioritize where you're focusing at this time. We like to focus on at certain issues, what we call a metric on fire, in 90-day kind of sprints. So some testing benchmarks for you. These are really important, kind of a checklist that you could take. And so when we're looking at setting up a test, doing it well, putting yourself in a place to succeed, this would very much be kind of your pre-test analysis and what you're setting up there. The first thing that's important is a minimum of 2 weeks. We always like to run tests at least 2 business cycles. And the reason is your performance is going to be different on a weekday versus a weekend. There can be things that change throughout the result of running the test. There's so many variables that can impact if you're just running a test for like 3 days. It's not going to be as trustworthy as if you were running it over a longer period of time. And so minimum of 2 weeks. There are exceptions where you just can't. You might have a promotion that you're running a test on and you can only run it for like 4 days. But this is important for probably 90% of the testing that you're doing, running it a minimum of 2 weeks. And then shoot for a minimum of 1,000 conversions. These aren't hard, fast rules, but these are great recommendations so that you can actually trust the results that you have. There's no magic number for the amount of conversions. The sample size calculator can really help you make sure that you have a trustworthy kind of sample size that you're planning to ultimately hit. You set your duration beforehand and you stick to that, right? You're not ending the test early. We see that so often where a test will get ended because it hits stat sig. What to expect in terms of lift. I see these case studies all the time. like a 20%, 30%, 50% conversion rate lift. Oftentimes, I'm sorry to say this, underneath that is really bad data, where the test wasn't ran long enough, there wasn't enough sample size, it's really underpowered. I'm not going to get into those terms, but ultimately what that means is you can't trust the data. If it ran longer, it could still win, but it's probably not going to be a 30% lift. It's probably going to be more like a 5 to 7% lift, or a 2 to 4% lift, or it could even be flat. And so anything beyond 15%, you should have healthy suspicion towards. What we see is like 2 to 4% is good, 5 to 7% is great, 7 to 12% is amazing. And those 7 to 12% are way more rare than the 2 to 4%.
It's good that you're calling out those benchmarks, because I think that it also goes back to that experimentation culture. A lot of people that are jumping into CRO is to solve a problem, when in reality, it's something that you do proactively to learn so that those problems don't happen. And
Exactly.
a lot of these numbers that you're like 20, 30, 50%, you're either a victim of a good bait click, or it's signaled that you need to look inwards and say, like, why am I looking at this, when in reality I know from other CRO practitioners that the truth is that 2 to 4% boosts or lifts are the common denominator, right? So I think that you have to like take those opportunities to actually look inwards and say, okay, I'm looking at this. Why am I looking at this? And identify the problem. What you were suggesting, Anthony, is like, what is my problem? Is it I'm getting pressure from stakeholders, hippos, that we need to drive more value out of the CRO program? But in reality, that value shouldn't come from a single test or a single framework that will prove for a 20, 30% lift, but found that compounding growth element and that iteration process that you were mentioning.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. And the last one here is just start with A versus B, your control versus a variant. That's going to be your best bet to start with. I just would not recommend going into multivariate testing. You have to have a significant amount of traffic, and it just adds a layer of complexity that most CRO programs are not ready to handle. Number 2 here is velocity. We recommend a minimum of 3 tests per month. And for most brands, you're maxing out at 5 to 6 tests. Sometimes you can handle more traffic than that, but the majority of the time, your process isn't ready to handle that velocity. So nail your process at a velocity like this before you move into a much higher velocity. When it comes to test mix, when we're talking test type, we have iterative, substantial, disruptive. We target 3 iterative or substantial tests for about every 1 disruptive test. That's a pretty good ratio there, and a benchmark that you can leverage. That way you're not always taking big swings. Again, it's not a hard, fast rule, but when you apply these 2 together, if you're trying to run 3 tests a month and they're all disruptive, good luck.
Anthony, before you move forward on the velocity, we did have a seated question from our community before the webinar started. What is the realistic test volume for a brand doing maybe 20 to 30 mil in revenue, per your experience, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that's where the minimum of 3 tests per month is what I would recommend. Start there. As you start to get the process working well, you're producing good learnings, then you can start to level up. If you're looking at 20 to 30K in revenue, it's hard to say how much traffic that is, but you probably have enough traffic that you could handle up to 5 tests, but I wouldn't start at 5. I would start at 3. That's where you're going to get learnings. You're going to get, if you're following the process, you're going to get wins. And then you can start to level up as you mature and then increase that velocity. But you're probably looking at no more than 5 tests with that type of revenue.
Thanks.
The last thing here is win rate, and this one's really important. If you're winning 70+% of the time, you should be asking, is the test data actually trustworthy? Are the tests in here, is there things that we should probably just be doing and not actually testing? Because if you're winning at that higher rate, you're probably not learning enough as a result of that. And there's things that you should just be bucketing into just do it's, and maybe getting a little bit more disruptive in your testing. if that is the case. And then if you're too low, which sometimes we see brands that are like at a 10%, when they're doing self-service, they're actually following good statistical kind of methodology and approach there, and they're only winning at 10%. Usually that's because you're not solving problems that are actually relevant and meaningful. If you're doing the prioritization framework, your research isn't driving your test ideas. And that's where you might need to be taking bigger swings. If you're a store that has a more optimized kind of experience where you've done testing over time, you might need to mix in some more disruptive swings, or you may need to consider segmenting by user type. And there's a variety of different ways that you can do that. But a healthy win rate is anywhere from 20 to 30%. You could be even upwards of 40%. But on average, we see it around kind of that 30% mark. So some testing red flags, and I've got a bunch of screenshots. I'm not going to call out anybody, but a bunch of screenshots from stuff that you'll see on LinkedIn in the Shopify space. That's actually really bad data that's backing it, where it's probably, if the result is going to be positive, it's not going to be nearly as positive as this screenshot is suggesting. And there's a good chance that it ends up being flat, potentially even negative. And so some red flags that I just want to check off here. Unfortunately, probably every single time you see one of these, you're now going to think about it through this lens. But if you have a 90% plus win rate, that's a red flag. If you're running tests under 2 weeks, that's a red flag. If you're calling wins with too few users or conversions, that's a red flag. Ideas that aren't rooted in clear data-driven problems. You have no hypothesis documentation, no post-test review process. Those are all red flags. Let's play a quick game here. So we have a screenshot. What's wrong with this test? So we have a test that had a 19.4% increase in conversion rate. It ran from June 30th to July 8th. There's about 757 orders. We're looking at this, the duration was less than a week. It had a really high conversion rate, which you should have healthy skepticism or suspicion about that. It did actually perform. I mean, I would say this is, if I plugged in the numbers, it's probably 90% plus confidence. But the biggest thing is it didn't hit enough users and it wasn't ran for 2 business cycles, right? This next one here that we look at, what's wrong with the data here? We actually have like what we consider a good lift, and it's not an astronomical number, like 30, 40%, but we're only seeing 96 plus orders
96
a month.
orders, yeah.
And so that seems like it was ran to a low sample size, right? And so you'll see the confidence interval. There's a wide spectrum in the actual
the range
lift.
is too broad, yeah.
Yeah, the interval for your lift could be -8%, or it could be positive 19%. If you're still seeing negatives in that interval, there's probably a chance that this result is not trustworthy. So I'm going to skip this slide because we're running out of time here.
Yes, I just want to call out that we're right on the dot. So let's try to wrap it up.
Yep. Sorry, I was long-winded, everybody.
No, it's okay. I interjected a lot, but no worries. I think it was valuable information, and people stuck around, so they were interested. So good for us.
Yep. So yeah, again, why this matters, we'll circle back to that example of this brand that was running in-house, and then they came to us, right? They were pushing forward tests that actually were riddled with poor data, not a clear research process, and as a result, their conversion rate is trending down. And so again, this matters if you want to produce long-term sustainable growth. You might be actually sabotaging performance and you don't even know it. So a couple of free resources for you guys. On the left here, which is the first one I'm going to call out, is our free CRO program diagnostic. So if you're not sure where your program stands, you're running CRO in-house, self-service as we called it. This is a 30-minute honest assessment, no fluff. We're really going to get into understanding how it's performing and give you some action items that you can then take and improve on the process. And so we've got 5 brand spots available for this. If you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to our form. The form is going to say conversion audit. You can just ignore that. Just fill out the form and you'll come through and you'll be bucketed into this, and you can set up a time to talk with us, and we'll be happy to dive into your program and give you some meaningful kind of action items that you can take forward. And then we've got our Shopify CRO upgrade kit that has a bunch of resources that you can leverage. Unfortunately, no time for Q&A. If you do have questions, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer those. And Eddie, I know you've got some closing thoughts here before we wrap things up.
Of course. Well, Anthony, again, thank you and Team Inavi for the wonderful session. And I want to thank everyone that stuck around and listened through. I think it was a great session to understand exactly where we need to focus on, especially when we see this type of numbers and red flags. But with that, I think I just want to thank you again and thank everybody for joining. If you need to talk about the presentation or anything CRO related, hit up Anthony over LinkedIn. There are 2 amazing resources. Again, there are 5 spots for a CRO diagnostic. So you better get on that QR code. Let's put that on the screen again so that people can scan it if they didn't have a chance, because there are only 5 spots and there are a bunch of you in it. So it's five spots for companies, not individuals. So make sure you fill that form up really fast so that you secure your spot and get your Shopify CRO upgrade toolkit. There are amazing things in it. I've seen it before and I think it's super useful. But with that, I thank you. And last closing thought, it wouldn't be me if I didn't do a plug here. If you are looking to partner up with a battle tested 15 years worth of experience tool for CRO, hit me up on LinkedIn, or my buddy Leonard managing the certified partnership program for agencies. With that said, Anthony, thank you so much again for joining us for the great session. And I look forward to a volume 3 in the near future, maybe 2026.
Yes, definitely. Coming February. Date
Coming February. There you go. Exactly. Thank you so much, man. And happy holidays to you and everyone.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Thanks, guys. Happy holidays.